What would you do if your quiet neighbor who never seemed to eat normal food turned out to be humanity's first contact with an advanced alien civilization? And what if that same neighbor, who you'd been unconsciously feeding homemade meals to for months, suddenly appeared at your door with what appeared to be a marriage contract written in symbols that glowed with their own light? Marcus Chen thought he was just being neighborly when he started leaving extra portions of his cooking outside apartment 4B. The woman who lived there, tall, pale, with the most unusual violet eyes, always seemed grateful but never quite looked right. She moved too gracefully, never seemed to blink at the right intervals, and her smile, while beautiful, held secrets that made his human instincts whisper warnings he chose to ignore. But when first contact protocols are thrown out the window by a simple act of human kindness, and when sharing your grandmother's secret recipe for beef stew accidentally becomes the most important diplomatic gesture in human history, Marcus discovers that sometimes the fate of two entire species can hinge on something as simple as whether you remember to add extra salt. This is the story of how humanity earned its place among the stars not through conquest or technology, but through the one thing that makes us truly human, our compulsive need to make sure everyone has had enough to eat. Marcus Chen had always been the kind of person who cooked too much food. It was a habit inherited from his grandmother, who had survived the Great Depression and never quite shook the fear that there might not be enough. Even living alone in his cramped downtown apartment, Marcus found himself preparing meals that could feed a small army, then spending the next 3 days eating leftovers until he was sick of his own cooking. The woman who moved into apartment 4B changed that routine in the most unexpected way. He first noticed her on a Tuesday morning in late September. Marcus was juggling his laptop bag, a coffee cup, and his keys when the elevator doors opened to reveal someone he'd never seen before in the building. She was tall, probably close to 6 feet, with platinum blonde hair that seemed to catch light in ways that didn't quite make sense. Her skin had an almost translucent quality, like fine porcelain, and her eyes were the most striking violet color he'd ever seen. "Morning," Marcus had said, stepping into the elevator beside her. She turned those unusual eyes toward him and smiled. It was a beautiful smile, perfectly symmetrical and bright, but something about it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Not in a bad way, exactly, just in a way that suggested his subconscious was picking up on details his conscious mind was missing. "Good morning," she'd replied, and her voice had a musical quality that seemed to resonate in frequencies just outside normal human hearing. That had been 3 months ago, and, in all that time, Marcus had learned exactly 3 things about his neighbor. Her name was Lyra, she was extremely quiet, and she never seemed to have any food deliveries. The last point bothered him more than it should have. Marcus worked from home as a freelance web developer, which meant he was around the building most days. He saw the parade of delivery drivers bringing groceries, takeout, and packages to every apartment except 4B. He'd never seen Lyra come home with shopping bags, never caught the smell of cooking food from her apartment, never heard the familiar sounds of meal preparation through their shared wall. It was possible she ate out for every meal, but Marcus had never seen her leave the building during typical mealtimes. She seemed to keep odd hours, sometimes hearing her moving around at 3 in the morning, but during normal lunch and dinner hours, her apartment was silent. The worry started small, just a nagging feeling that maybe his neighbor was struggling financially and too proud to ask for help. It grew stronger when he realized he'd never seen her with friends or family, never heard her talking to anyone in the hallways, never noticed any signs of a social life that might include shared meals. Marcus had grown up in a family where feeding people was how you showed love. His grandmother had pressed food on anyone who entered her house, convinced that a full stomach was the foundation of both happiness and trust. His parents had continued the tradition, and family gatherings always revolved around massive spreads of home-cooked meals that left everyone uncomfortably stuffed but emotionally satisfied. The idea that someone might be going hungry just a few feet away from where he was throwing away leftovers felt wrong on a level that went deeper than simple neighborly concern. So Marcus started leaving food outside her door. It began with a simple container of his grandmother's beef stew. He'd made a huge batch on a Sunday afternoon, enough to last him the entire week, and found himself staring at the massive pot with familiar frustration. On impulse, he'd ladled a generous portion into one of his good glass containers, added a handwritten note explaining that he'd made too much and thought she might enjoy it, and left it outside apartment 4B. The container was gone within an hour. 2 days later, Marcus found the container sitting outside his own door, washed spotless and accompanied by a note written in the most beautiful handwriting he'd ever seen. The paper itself felt expensive, heavier than normal notebook paper, and the ink seemed to shimmer slightly in the hallway light. "Thank you for your kindness," the note read. "The meal was extraordinary. I have not tasted anything so perfect in a very long time." Something about the phrasing struck Marcus as odd, but he was too pleased by the positive response to analyze it closely. The next week, when he made his famous chicken and dumplings, he automatically prepared an extra portion. This time, when the container was returned, it came with a small gift, a smooth, dark stone that felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. The accompanying note was equally polite and formal: "Please accept this small token of appreciation. Your generosity honors both giver and receiver." Marcus had never seen a stone quite like it. It looked almost like obsidian, but obsidian was cold and sharp-edged. This stone was perfectly smooth and seemed to generate its own gentle heat. When he held it up to the light, he could swear he saw patterns moving just beneath the surface, like slow lightning frozen in glass. He kept the stone on his kitchen counter, where it seemed to make the whole room feel warmer and somehow more alive. When he cooked, he found himself glancing at it, and each time it seemed to pulse a little brighter, as if responding to his attention. The food exchanges became a weekly ritual. Every time Marcus cooked something special, he prepared an extra portion for Lyra. She always returned the container within a day or two, always perfectly clean, always accompanied by a gracious note and sometimes a small gift. The gifts were always unusual: stones that seemed to glow with their own light, pressed flowers that never seemed to wilt, small pieces of metal that felt impossibly light and rang like bells when touched. Marcus started looking forward to the exchanges more than he wanted to admit. There was something thrilling about the mystery of his neighbor, something that made his routine feel less mundane and more like the beginning of an adventure story. He began experimenting with different cuisines, curious to see how Lyra would respond. His grandmother's Italian recipes earned him a crystal that sang softly when the wind hit it. His attempt at Thai curry resulted in a small vial of liquid that glowed soft blue and made his apartment smell like ocean breezes for days. When he tried his hand at Indian food, he received what looked like a pressed flower, except the flower was made of some kind of metal so fine it felt like silk. The gifts accumulated on his kitchen counter, turning his ordinary apartment into something that felt magical. Friends who visited commented on the unusual decorations, asking where he'd found such unique pieces. Marcus found himself making vague references to a local artist rather than trying to explain the truth, mostly because he wasn't entirely sure what the truth was. He started paying closer attention to Lyra herself, curious about the person behind the beautiful handwriting and unusual gifts. She kept irregular hours, sometimes leaving the building at dawn, sometimes not returning until well after midnight. When he did see her in the hallways or elevator, she was always impeccably dressed in clothes that looked expensive but somehow timeless, as if they could have been made yesterday or 100 years ago. Her style never quite matched current fashion trends. The cuts were elegant and flattering, but there was something about the proportions that seemed slightly off, as if they'd been designed for someone with different body mechanics. The fabrics looked familiar from a distance but revealed unusual textures and patterns up close, often seeming to shift subtly in different lighting. Lyra herself remained polite but distant. She always greeted Marcus warmly when they met, always thanked him for the food with genuine enthusiasm, but she never volunteered personal information or asked questions that might lead to deeper conversation. It was as if she existed behind an invisible barrier that allowed for pleasantries but nothing more substantial. Marcus found himself wondering about her background. Her accent was hard to place, containing hints of European formality but without any clear regional markers. Her vocabulary was extensive and precise, but she sometimes used phrases that sounded almost archaic, like someone who had learned English from very old books. When she spoke, there was often a slight delay, as if she was translating her thoughts from another language before speaking. The mystery deepened when Marcus realized he'd never heard any normal apartment sounds from 4B. No television, no music, no running water at typical times, no footsteps during normal waking hours. The building's walls were thin enough that he could hear his upstairs neighbor's morning routine and the couple next door arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash, but Lyra's apartment might as well have been empty for all the domestic noise it produced. Sometimes, late at night, Marcus would hear something that sounded almost like singing, but in frequencies that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his chest. The sound was beautiful and haunting, like whale songs crossed with wind chimes, but it never lasted long enough for him to be certain he'd actually heard it. Marcus started making excuses to be in the hallway when he thought Lyra might be coming or going, hoping for a chance at more substantial conversation. He learned that she moved with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, her feet barely making sound on the creaky wooden floors that announced everyone else's movements. She never seemed to carry keys, but he never saw her fumble with the lock on her door either. The more he observed, the more questions accumulated. How did someone survive without apparently buying groceries? How did she afford what looked like designer clothes on no visible income? Where did she go during her long absences from the building? And, most puzzling of all, where did she get the unusual gifts she left for him? Marcus found himself researching online, trying to identify the stones and crystals Lyra had given him. Some looked similar to known minerals, but none matched exactly. The properties were all wrong too. Stones that should have been cold stayed warm, crystals that should have been brittle seemed impossible to scratch, and metals that looked heavy felt lighter than aluminum. He considered asking her directly about the gifts, but something held him back. There was an unspoken understanding between them that their relationship existed within specific boundaries. He provided food, she provided thanks and tokens of appreciation, and neither of them asked too many questions about the other's circumstances. It felt like a delicate balance that might shatter if examined too closely. Instead, Marcus channeled his curiosity into his cooking. If Lyra appreciated good food as much as her notes suggested, then he would give her the best meals he was capable of preparing. He started researching new techniques, ordering specialty ingredients, spending entire weekends perfecting dishes he'd never attempted before. His efforts were always rewarded. The more complex and flavorful the meal, the more unusual and beautiful the gift that accompanied its return. Marcus began to suspect that there was some kind of system at work, as if the value of Lyra's gifts was carefully calibrated to match the effort he'd put into each dish. The thought should have bothered him more than it did. It suggested a level of calculation that seemed at odds with simple neighborly gratitude. But Marcus found himself charmed rather than disturbed by the idea that Lyra was putting serious thought into her responses to his cooking. It felt like a game with rules he didn't understand but was learning to play instinctively. As autumn progressed into winter, the food exchanges became the highlight of Marcus's week. He would spend days planning each meal, considering not just flavors and techniques but what kind of response each dish might provoke. Lyra's notes grew longer and more detailed, offering specific compliments about seasoning choices and cooking methods that suggested a sophisticated understanding of cuisine that went far beyond casual appreciation. Marcus began to feel as if he was being evaluated by an expert, someone whose standards were impossibly high but whose approval, once earned, meant more than any professional recognition he'd ever received. He started treating each meal as a culinary exam, pushing himself to demonstrate skills he'd never known he possessed. The gifts continued to accumulate, transforming his apartment into a gallery of impossible objects that seemed to exist at the intersection of art and science. Marcus started photographing them, partly to document their beauty and partly because he was beginning to suspect they might be more significant than simple tokens of appreciation. Winter deepened, and, with it, Marcus's fascination with his mysterious neighbor grew stronger. He found himself thinking about Lyra at odd moments throughout the day, wondering what she did during the long hours when her apartment was silent, where she went when she disappeared for days at a time, and, most importantly, what kind of person could create or acquire objects that seemed to defy conventional understanding of physics and material science. The answers, when they finally came, would change everything Marcus thought he knew about the world and his place in it. The first sign that something was fundamentally different about Lyra came on a Thursday evening in early December. Marcus had spent the better part of the day preparing what he considered his masterpiece, a complex French dish called coq au vin that required hours of careful preparation and precise timing. He'd sourced organic chicken from a local farm, spent a small fortune on authentic Burgundy wine for the sauce, and hand-picked herbs from the rooftop garden he'd started maintaining specifically for his cooking experiments. The finished dish was perfect. The chicken fell off the bone, the sauce had achieved that deep, complex flavor that only came from patience and proper technique, and the aroma filled his entire apartment with warmth and richness that made him feel proud of his accomplishment. He portioned out a generous serving for Lyra, including extra sauce and the pearl onions that had taken him an hour to peel and caramelize properly. As always, he left the container outside apartment 4B with a note explaining what he prepared and expressing hope that she would enjoy it. What happened next changed everything. Marcus was settling down with his own portion when he heard the unmistakable sound of Lyra's door opening. This wasn't unusual, she always retrieved his offerings quickly, but this time, instead of the soft click of her door closing, he heard something else entirely. It started as a low humming sound, almost below the threshold of hearing. Then, the humming resolved into what could only be described as music, but unlike anything Marcus had ever heard before. The melody seemed to contain harmonies that shouldn't have been possible for a single voice to produce, frequencies that resonated in his bones and made the air in his apartment feel somehow thicker and more alive. The singing continued for nearly 20 minutes, and during that time, Marcus found himself unable to move from his position on the couch. It wasn't that he was paralyzed, he simply didn't want to disturb whatever was happening in the apartment next door. The music was so beautiful, so otherworldly, that interrupting it felt like it would be an act of vandalism against something sacred. When the singing finally stopped, the silence that followed felt profound and heavy. Marcus sat in the darkness of his living room, trying to process what he'd just experienced. He'd heard Lyra's late-night vocalizations before, but nothing like this. This had been a performance, a celebration, a response to something that had moved her deeply. The next morning, Marcus found his container returned with a gift unlike any of the others. Instead of a stone or crystal or pressed flower, Lyra had left him what appeared to be a small piece of artwork. It looked like a three-dimensional constellation, with points of light connected by lines so fine they were barely visible. The entire sculpture fit in the palm of his hand, but, when he looked at it closely, the light seemed to extend infinitely inward, creating a sense of depth that defied the physical dimensions of the object. The accompanying note was longer than usual and written on paper that seemed to shimmer with its own internal light. Marcus, it read, "Your creation last evening touched something in me that I had thought lost. The care and skill you demonstrated, the attention to each element, the way you balanced flavors and textures to create something greater than the sum of its parts, this is art of the highest order. I have traveled far and tasted many things, but never have I encountered someone who understands so intuitively that nourishment is about more than mere sustenance. Please accept this small representation of the Andromeda system as seen from a place very dear to me. Your kindness deserves to be honored with something equally beautiful." Marcus read the note 3 times before the implications began to sink in. The Andromeda system? As in the Andromeda galaxy? And what did she mean by traveled far? The phrasing suggested distances that went well beyond normal vacation destinations. He looked more closely at the sculpture, and, with a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather, he realized that the pattern of lights did indeed look like a star map. Not like any constellation visible from Earth, but unmistakably astronomical in nature. The proportions, the way the lights clustered and connected, the three-dimensional relationships between points, it all suggested someone with intimate knowledge of stellar arrangements. Marcus spent the rest of the day researching astronomy online, comparing the sculpture to every star map and galaxy image he could find. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about his neighbor. The sculpture was an accurate three-dimensional representation of the Andromeda galaxy as it would appear from a specific vantage point roughly 2.5 million light-years from Earth. The level of detail was impossible. It showed not just the major spiral arms that would be visible from such a distance, but individual star clusters and nebulae that would require technology far beyond current human capabilities to observe and map. Marcus set the sculpture down with shaking hands. There were only 2 possible explanations: either Lyra had access to astronomical data that didn't officially exist, or she was telling him something about herself that challenged his understanding of reality. He started paying attention to details he'd previously dismissed as quirky personal habits. The way Lyra never seemed to blink at normal intervals. The fact that her skin always looked perfect, never showing signs of fatigue or stress or seasonal dryness. Her uncanny ability to move silently through a building where every floorboard creaked. The clothes that never quite matched current fashions but looked timeless rather than outdated. Most unsettling of all, Marcus realized he'd never seen Lyra in direct sunlight. She arrived at and left the building during dawn and dusk hours, when the light was soft and indirect. The few times he'd encountered her during full daylight, she'd been wearing large sunglasses and seemed to stay in the shadows. Marcus found himself developing theories that ranged from reasonable to ridiculous. Maybe Lyra was an artist who specialized in scientifically accurate astronomical sculptures. Maybe she had connections to NASA or other space agencies that gave her access to advanced imaging data. Maybe she was just really good at research and had spent weeks creating something that looked more accurate than it actually was. But the theories felt forced, like explanations that failed to account for the full scope of what he'd observed. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that his interactions with Lyra had been accumulating small impossibilities that he'd been unconsciously dismissing because the alternative explanations were too strange to consider seriously. The gifts, for instance. Marcus had assumed they were just unusual art objects or perhaps mineral specimens from exotic locations. But now he started examining them with more critical attention, and what he found defied easy categorization. The stones that stayed warm weren't just retaining heat, they were generating it. Marcus tested this by leaving one of them in his refrigerator overnight. When he retrieved it the next morning, it was still warm to the touch, as if it contained some internal heat source that wasn't affected by ambient temperature. The crystals that sang in the wind weren't just resonating with air currents, they were producing harmonics that seemed to respond to his emotional state. When Marcus was happy, the tones were bright and uplifting. When he was stressed about a work deadline, the same crystal produced deeper, more calming frequencies that seemed designed to soothe anxiety. The pressed flowers that never wilted weren't preserved through any process Marcus could identify. They looked and felt fresh, as if they'd been picked moments before, but they showed no signs of age or decay despite having been in his apartment for weeks. When he examined one under a magnifying glass, he could see that the cellular structure looked normal, but somehow frozen in perfect stasis. Most disturbing of all were the metal objects. They looked like ordinary decorative items, small sculptures, jewelry-like pieces, abstract shapes, but they defied every physical property metals were supposed to have. They were impossibly light, never showed fingerprints or tarnish, and seemed to change color subtly in different lighting conditions. When Marcus accidentally dropped one, it made no sound when it hit the floor and showed no damage from the impact. Marcus started keeping notes, documenting each gift and its unusual properties. He photographed them from different angles, tested their responses to various conditions, and tried to research similar objects online. What he found was a complete absence of anything comparable. No artist, no manufacturer, no scientific institution seemed to be producing objects with the specific combination of properties he was observing. The conclusion that began forming in his mind was so outlandish that Marcus spent days trying to dismiss it. But the evidence kept accumulating, and the alternative explanations kept falling apart under scrutiny. Lyra wasn't human. The thought should have terrified him. It should have sent him running to the authorities or at least prompted him to stop the food exchanges and avoid further contact. Instead, Marcus found himself oddly calm about the possibility. If Lyra wasn't human, she was certainly the most benevolent non-human entity anyone could hope to encounter. She was quiet, considerate, appreciative of his cooking, and had never shown any signs of hostility or harmful intent. More than that, Marcus realized he was honored by her trust. If she was indeed something other than human, if she was hiding her true nature from the world, then the fact that she was accepting his food and reciprocating with what were clearly precious gifts suggested a level of faith in his character that was both humbling and thrilling. Marcus decided to test his theory in the most direct way he could think of. He would prepare a meal specifically designed to provoke a response that might reveal more about Lyra's true nature. He spent a week researching and planning. If Lyra was from somewhere else, somewhere far enough away to have detailed knowledge of the Andromeda Galaxy, then she might be familiar with ingredients or flavor combinations that were unknown on Earth. Conversely, there might be uniquely Earth-based foods that would provoke a strong reaction because they were completely novel to her experience. Marcus decided to prepare a dish that showcased the most distinctly terrestrial flavors he could think of, a complex mole sauce that incorporated over 20 ingredients, including several varieties of chili peppers that were native to specific regions of Earth and had never been successfully cultivated elsewhere. The sauce required 2 days of preparation, with multiple stages of roasting, grinding, and slow simmering that filled his apartment with aromas so rich and complex they seemed to have physical weight. The finished dish was served over locally raised duck that Marcus had brined for 24 hours in a mixture that included maple syrup from Vermont, sea salt from the coast of Maine, and herbs from his rooftop garden. Every element of the meal was designed to taste unmistakably of Earth, of specific places and traditions and ingredients that could only exist in this particular planetary ecosystem. Marcus left the container outside Lyra's door with a note explaining the cultural significance of mole sauce in Mexican cuisine and expressing his hope that she would find the flavors interesting. Then, he waited. The response exceeded his wildest expectations. 3 hours after he'd left the food, Marcus heard Lyra's door open. But, instead of the usual quiet retrieval, he heard footsteps approaching his own door. When he looked through the peephole, he saw Lyra standing in the hallway, holding his container and looking directly at his door with an expression of wonder and something that might have been longing. She knocked, a soft, musical pattern that somehow conveyed both gratitude and urgency. Marcus opened the door to find Lyra transformed. Her usual composed demeanor had been replaced by an excitement so intense it seemed to radiate from her like heat. Her violet eyes were brighter than he'd ever seen them, almost glowing in the hallway's fluorescent lighting, and, when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made his ribs vibrate gently. "Marcus," she said, "I must know where you acquired these flavors. They are unlike anything in my experience, but they speak to something fundamental about the nature of growth and soil and rain and sunshine. How is it possible that such complexity exists in a single dish?" It was the most words she'd ever spoken to him at one time, and the most emotion she'd ever displayed. Marcus found himself staring at her, taking in details that confirmed his growing suspicions. Her skin had that translucent quality he'd noticed before, but now he could see that it wasn't just pale, it seemed to have depth, as if he was looking at her through crystal clear water. Her breathing was almost imperceptible, and, when she moved, it was with a fluidity that suggested a different relationship to gravity than most humans possessed. "I grew most of the ingredients myself," Marcus said carefully, "or sourced them from local farms. The recipe is traditional Mexican, but I adapted it based on what was available in this region." Lyra's expression shifted to something like amazement. "You cultivated these flavors yourself? You shaped the soil and guided the growth to produce exactly the tastes you desired?" The phrasing struck Marcus as odd, but he nodded. "I have a small garden on the roof. Nothing fancy, but I enjoy growing herbs and vegetables." "Could you?" Lyra hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "Would it be possible for me to see this garden? I find myself intensely curious about the process by which such flavors are created." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. This was the first time Lyra had ever requested anything beyond their usual food exchange. It felt like a significant escalation in their relationship, a crossing of boundaries that had been carefully maintained for months. "Of course," he said. "I was just heading up there to check on things anyway." The rooftop garden was Marcus's pride and joy, a collection of raised beds and container plants that he'd been cultivating for 3 years. It wasn't large, but it was diverse, containing herbs from 6 different continents, vegetables that ranged from common to exotic, and a small section devoted to experimental hybrids he'd been developing through careful seed saving and selective breeding. Lyra's reaction to the garden confirmed every suspicion Marcus had been developing about her true nature. She moved through the space with reverence that bordered on worship, touching the soil with fingertips that seemed to glow slightly in the dim evening light. When she encountered plants she recognized, her face lit up with joy. When she found species that were apparently new to her experience, she spent long minutes examining them with scientific precision, studying leaf structures and growth patterns with an intensity that suggested professional botanical knowledge. "This is extraordinary," she said finally, turning to Marcus with an expression of pure gratitude. "You have created a microcosm of planetary diversity. Each plant represents a different evolutionary path, a unique solution to the challenges of survival and reproduction. And you have brought them together in harmony, allowing them to thrive in proximity despite their different origins." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. The way Lyra was describing his garden sounded like the observations of someone who was familiar with planetary diversity on a scale that extended far beyond Earth. "It's just a hobby," he said quietly. "I like growing things." Lyra looked at him with an expression so intense it made him feel as if she was seeing straight through to his soul. "Marcus," she said, "there is nothing just about what you do. You nurture life. You create beauty and nourishment and joy from simple earth and water and attention. In my experience, such gifts are rare and precious beyond measure. The conversation that followed changed everything Marcus thought he knew about his place in the universe. Standing in his rooftop garden under the pale December stars, Marcus watched Lyra move among his plants with a grace and understanding that defied human explanation. She touched each specimen with reverence, murmuring comments in what sounded like multiple languages, some of which contained sounds his throat couldn't have produced. "Lyra," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you?" She froze, her hand hovering over a cluster of sage plants he'd been nurturing for 2 years. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't respond. Then, slowly, she straightened and turned to face him. In the moonlight, the pretense fell away completely. Her skin seemed to emit its own soft luminescence, and her eyes held depths that looked like windows into deep space. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the air around them shimmer. "I am Lyraethus of the Andorian Collective," she said, each word precisely articulated and heavy with meaning. "I am what your people would call an xenobiologist, a scholar of life in all its forms across the galaxy. I have been observing your species for the past 18 of your months as part of a comprehensive evaluation." Marcus felt his legs go weak. He sank down onto the edge of a raised bed, staring at this being who had been living next door to him for months. "An evaluation of what?" "Of humanity's readiness for formal contact," Lyra said, settling gracefully onto a nearby garden stool. Even sitting, she maintained that impossible poise that had always made him slightly uncomfortable. "My people have been watching your species' development for several of your centuries. We have protocols for introducing ourselves to emerging civilizations, but the process requires careful assessment to determine whether contact would be beneficial or harmful to both parties." Marcus's mind raced, trying to process the implications. "So you're like a scout? Gathering intelligence on whether humanity is worth talking to?" "In crude terms, yes," Lyra said, though her expression suggested the reality was more complex. "But our assessment criteria are not what you might expect. We are not particularly concerned with your technology or your military capabilities or your political structures. These things can be taught or improved or modified. What we evaluate is more fundamental." "Which is?" "Character," Lyra said simply. "Compassion. The capacity for growth and cooperation. The ability to see beyond immediate self-interest. The tendency to create rather than destroy. And, most importantly, the instinct to care for those who cannot care for themselves." Marcus stared at her, understanding beginning to dawn. "The food exchanges. You weren't just being neighborly." Lyra's expression softened, and, for the first time since he'd known her, she looked almost vulnerable. "I was supposed to observe from a distance. My mission parameters were clear: maintain minimal contact, avoid forming personal attachments, gather data through remote surveillance and occasional controlled interactions." "But, you..." She paused, seeming to struggle with words. "You made that impossible." "How so?" "You began leaving food outside my door without any expectation of reciprocation. You prepared meals with obvious care and skill, then gave them freely to someone you barely knew. When I attempted to maintain appropriate distance by reciprocating with small gifts, you responded by putting even more effort into your cooking, as if my appreciation had inspired you to greater acts of generosity." Lyra stood and began pacing around the garden, her movements fluid and hypnotic in the moonlight. "Marcus, do you understand how rare that behavior is? In all my travels across the galaxy, studying dozens of species at various stages of development, I have never encountered a being who consistently chooses kindness over caution, generosity over self-preservation, creativity over efficiency." "I just cooked some extra food," Marcus protested. "It's not like I saved the world." "But you might have," Lyra said, stopping to look at him directly. "You see, my evaluation of humanity will determine whether the collective makes formal contact with your species. And my evaluation has been based primarily on you." The weight of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Me? But I'm nobody special. I'm just a guy who works from home and grows vegetables." "You are a being who noticed that his neighbor might be hungry and chose to do something about it," Lyra said firmly. "You are someone who has spent months perfecting the art of nourishment, not for profit or recognition, but because you find joy in creating pleasure for others. You have transformed simple ingredients into experiences of beauty and comfort and satisfaction. You have made an alien feel welcome in a strange world. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the implications. So what happens now? Do you report back that humanity is ready for contact because I can cook? Lyra's laugh was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. It is more complex than that, but, yes, essentially. My recommendation will carry significant weight with the collective council. Your behavior suggests that humans possess the moral foundation necessary for positive integration into the galactic community. But, what about wars and poverty and environmental destruction and all the horrible things humans do to each other? All species go through these phases, Lyra said gently. Technological development often outpaces social and moral development, creating periods of chaos and destruction. The question is whether the species possesses the underlying capacity for wisdom and compassion. Your actions suggest that humanity does. Marcus stood up slowly, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what he was hearing. So my cooking could determine the fate of the entire human race? Your kindness, Lyra corrected. Your instinct to nurture and share and create beauty. These are the qualities that matter to advanced civilizations. Technology can be shared, but character must be inherent. They spent the next hour in the garden while Lyra explained more about the collective and the process of evaluating emerging species. The Andorian Collective was a federation of over 300 worlds, spanning multiple galaxies and including dozens of different species. They had learned through bitter experience that premature contact with developing civilizations could be disastrous for both sides. We made mistakes in the past, Lyra explained, settling cross-legged in front of a patch of winter herds that seemed to lean toward her presence. We approached species based solely on their technological achievements, only to discover that advanced weapons in the hands of morally immature beings led to destruction on scales we had never imagined. Now we are much more careful. How do you usually evaluate species? Marcus asked. We send observers to live among the population for extended periods. We study their art, their literature, their treatment of the vulnerable, their relationship with their environment. We look for evidence of wisdom, empathy, and the capacity for growth. Most importantly, we observe how individuals behave when they believe no one is watching. Marcus felt a chill of realization. You've been watching me this whole time. Everything I did, every meal I cooked, every interaction we had, it was all part of your evaluation. Yes, Lyra said simply. But, Marcus, you must understand that my assessment was supposed to be purely observational. I was not meant to form personal attachments or allow my emotions to influence my professional judgment. But, you did? Lyra was quiet for a long moment, and, when she spoke, her voice carried notes of wonder and confusion. Your kindness was unexpected. The consistency of it, the joy you took in giving, the way you seemed to find genuine satisfaction in my appreciation, it challenged everything I thought I understood about emerging species behavior. How so? Most beings, when they reach your level of technological and social development, have learned to be cautious about strangers. They give help when asked, but they rarely offer it spontaneously. They are generous with friends and family, but suspicious of outsiders. They perform acts of kindness when they expect recognition or reciprocation, but not when they believe their efforts will go unnoticed. Lyra touched one of Marcus's tomato plants, and the leaves seemed to brighten under her fingers. But you broke every pattern we have observed. You gave freely, consistently, creatively. You improved your offerings over time not because I asked you to, but because you wanted to share the best you could create. You found joy in anonymous generosity. And that's unusual? Marcus, Lyra said, looking at him with an expression of profound gratitude, in 3 centuries of galactic observation, we have documented fewer than 50 individuals across all species who demonstrate that level of spontaneous, sustained altruism. You are genuinely exceptional. The revelation was overwhelming. Marcus had spent his entire life thinking of himself as perfectly ordinary, someone who had stumbled into a routine job and a quiet life without ever accomplishing anything significant. The idea that his simple acts of neighborly kindness could be seen as extraordinary by an advanced alien civilization was almost impossible to process. But what about the rest of humanity, he asked. I can't be the only person who cooks for their neighbors. You are not, Lyra agreed. And that is part of why my evaluation will be positive. Your behavior is unusual but not unique. We have observed similar patterns in humans across different cultures and circumstances. The capacity for spontaneous kindness appears to be more widespread in your species than in most others we have studied. So humanity passes your test? The evaluation process is more complex than a simple pass or fail, Lyra explained. But, yes, my recommendation will be that humans are ready for limited contact. We will begin with small-scale interactions, cultural and scientific exchanges, gradual introduction of technologies that could improve your quality of life without disrupting your social development. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and terror at the implications. When will this happen? That depends on the collective council, but probably within the next few of your years. First contact protocols require extensive planning and careful preparation on both sides. And what happens to you? Do you go back to your people now that your mission is complete? Lyra's expression grew complicated, and Marcus could see her struggling with emotions that seemed to be pulling her in different directions. My official assignment is complete, yes. I should return to Andoria and submit my final report to the council. Should? Marcus, Lyra said quietly, I have never experienced anything like the past few months. Sharing your meals, receiving your kindness, witnessing your creativity and generosity, it has changed me in ways I did not think were possible. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. There was something in Lyra's tone, an uncertainty and longing that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere he hadn't expected. Changed how? I have observed dozens of species across multiple galaxies, but I have always remained detached, professional, objective. I have never felt anything approaching personal attachment to my subjects. But, with you. She paused, seeming to gather courage. With you, I have discovered emotions I did not know I was capable of experiencing. What kind of emotions? Lyra looked directly into his eyes, and Marcus saw vulnerability there that took his breath away. Affection. Gratitude. Joy. And something else, something that my people have a word for but that I had never understood until now. Which is? Kethera, she said softly. The desire to build a life with another being. To create shared experiences and mutual growth and deep understanding. What you might call love. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Marcus stared at this beautiful, impossible being who had just confessed to loving him, and realized that everything he had been feeling for months finally made sense. Lyra, he said carefully, are you saying what I think you're saying? I am saying that I do not want to leave, she said simply. I am saying that the thought of returning to my previous life, of never again experiencing your kindness or tasting your cooking or sharing quiet moments in this garden, feels like a form of death I am not prepared to face. Marcus stood up slowly, his mind racing with possibilities and complications and hopes he was afraid to voice. But, you have responsibilities to your people. You can't just abandon your mission. My mission is complete, Lyra said firmly. My evaluation is finished, my report will be submitted. What I do after that is my own choice. And, what do you choose? Lyra rose gracefully and moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the patterns of light that moved just beneath her skin, could smell the strange, sweet fragrance that always surrounded her. I choose you, she said simply. If you will have me. If you can accept a life that will be more complicated and dangerous and wonderful than anything you have imagined. Marcus looked at this extraordinary being who had chosen him, who had found in his simple acts of kindness something worth abandoning an entire civilization for. The sensible part of his mind catalogued all the ways such a relationship would be impossible, all the complications and challenges and unknowns they would face. But a deeper part of him, the part that had been drawn to Lyra's mystery from the very beginning, already knew his answer. Yes, he said, reaching out to take her hand. Her skin was warm and seemed to pulse with gentle energy that made his fingers tingle. Whatever comes next, I want to face it with you. Lyra's smile was like sunrise, bright and transformative and full of promise. Then, we must discuss the traditional courtship rituals of my people, she said, and there was something in her tone that suggested Marcus's quiet life was about to become very interesting indeed.
The morning after Lyra's revelation, Marcus woke up wondering if he'd dreamed the entire impossible conversation.
But, when he walked into his kitchen to make coffee, he found a new gift waiting on his counter, a small crystalline device that projected a three-dimensional star map showing Earth's location relative to what the accompanying note identified as the Andorian home system. So that really happened, Marcus murmured, touching the device and watching as the projection shifted to show travel routes between the 2 points. The distances were incomprehensible, measured in units that his human brain couldn't fully grasp, but the technology that could create such precise representations was obviously far beyond anything Earth possessed. Over the next few days, Lyra began sharing more details about her civilization and what a relationship between them would actually entail. The conversations took place in his apartment now, rather than through notes and brief hallway encounters, and Marcus quickly learned that Andorian courtship customs were both more complex and more romantic than anything human culture had developed. "Among my people," Lyra explained one evening as they sat in his living room surrounded by the gifts she'd given him over the months, "courtship is considered the most important undertaking of one's existence.
It requires demonstration of compatibility across 7 different dimensions of being."
Marcus settled back into his couch, noting how Lyra seemed more relaxed and natural now that she was no longer hiding her true nature. Her skin glowed softly in the lamplight, and, when she moved, he could see patterns of bioluminescence shifting just beneath the surface like slow lightning.
7 dimensions, he asked. That sounds complicated.
"It is thorough," Lyra said with a smile that held warmth but also determination. "My people learned long ago that lasting partnerships require harmony across multiple aspects of existence. Physical compatibility, intellectual stimulation, emotional resonance, creative synergy, spiritual alignment, temporal synchronization, and what we call essence bonding."
"And we need to prove all of that?"
"We need to explore all of that," Lyra corrected gently. "The exploration itself is part of the courtship process. If we discover incompatibilities that cannot be resolved, it is better to learn this early rather than commit to a partnership that would ultimately cause suffering." Marcus considered this pragmatic approach to romance. It seemed both more rational and more romantic than human dating customs, which often seem to rely more on chemistry and hope than actual compatibility assessment.
"How long does this process usually take?" "Typically between 1 and 3 of your years," Lyra said.
"Though there have been courtships that lasted decades and others that achieved perfect resonance within months.
The timeline is less important than the thoroughness of the exploration." "And what happens if we don't achieve perfect resonance?" Lyra's expression grew serious.
"Then, I would return to my people with fond memories and gratitude for the experience. And you would continue your life knowing that you had been loved by someone from the stars, which is not an insignificant thing." Marcus felt a chill at the casual way she discussed the possibility of leaving.
"But you said you didn't want to go back to your previous life."
"I said I did not want to return to a life without you," Lyra clarified. "But I will not trap either of us in an incompatible partnership simply to avoid that outcome. If we cannot build something genuine and sustainable together, then the kindest thing for both of us would be separation." The logic was unassailable, but Marcus found himself wondering if he could handle the emotional reality of such an arrangement. He was already more invested in this relationship than any he'd ever experienced, and the thought of spending months or years exploring their compatibility only to discover they weren't meant to be together felt like signing up for guaranteed heartbreak.
"What does the exploration process actually involve?" he asked. Lyra's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "It is different for each couple, tailored to their unique circumstances and interests.
For us, I believe it will center around food and growth and creativity, since these are the foundations of our connection." Over the following weeks, Lyra introduced Marcus to Andorian courtship traditions that challenged everything he thought he knew about relationships. Instead of casual dates and gradual intimacy, their exploration followed structured phases designed to reveal deep truths about their compatibility. The first phase was called nourishment sharing, which went far beyond the food exchanges they'd already been practicing. Lyra explained that in Andorian culture, the way someone prepared and shared food revealed core aspects of their character, their relationship to the natural world, and their capacity for nurturing others. "We will prepare meals together," Lyra said, "using ingredients from both of our worlds. This will allow us to observe how we collaborate, how we handle unfamiliar challenges, how we balance tradition with innovation. The first joint cooking session was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Lyra arrived at his apartment carrying ingredients that defied easy categorization. Some looked familiar but behaved strangely when heated or combined with terrestrial spices. Others were completely alien, with textures and flavors that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum of human taste perception. "This is Kithera root," Lyra said, showing him something that looked like a cross between ginger and crystal. "It grows in the deep soil of my home world, where the minerals from 3 different moons create unique growing conditions. When prepared properly, it produces harmonics that resonate with the nervous system, creating a sense of peace and clarity." Marcus watched as Lyra prepared the root using techniques that seemed part chemistry, part art, and part meditation. She moved with perfect precision, but also with reverence for the ingredients that spoke to something deeper than mere culinary skill. "Can you teach me?" he asked. "I can guide you," Lyra said, "but ultimately you must find your own relationship with each ingredient." Cooking, at its highest level, is not about following recipes but about creating harmony between the cook, the ingredients, and those who will receive nourishment. Working together in his small kitchen, Marcus discovered that Lyra's approach to food was both more technical and more intuitive than his own. She understood the molecular interactions between different ingredients in ways that seemed to combine advanced chemistry with almost mystical sensitivity to subtle energies. But she also cooked with emotional intent, infusing each dish with specific feelings and intentions that somehow survived the cooking process and affected the final flavor. "You cook with love," she observed as Marcus prepared his grandmother's bread recipe using techniques he'd learned through years of practice. "But, more than that, you cook with memory and tradition and hope. Each loaf carries the weight of all the times this recipe has been shared, all the families it has nourished, all the comfort it has provided." Marcus paused in his kneading, startled by the accuracy of her observation. "How can you tell that?" "Your hands know the dough," Lyra said simply. "You touch it with familiarity that comes not just from practice but from connection to those who taught you. You are not just making bread, you are continuing a conversation that began with your grandmother and will continue long after we are gone." The meals they created together were extraordinary, combining terrestrial ingredients with Andorian techniques to produce flavors that neither of them could have achieved alone. Marcus found himself learning not just new cooking methods but new ways of thinking about food as communication, as art, as a form of love made tangible. The second phase of courtship was called growth witnessing, which involved sharing and nurturing each other's creative pursuits. For Marcus, this meant expanding his rooftop garden to include plants that Lyra had brought from her home world. For Lyra, it meant learning about human artistic expression and exploring her own creative potential within terrestrial limitations. "My people express creativity primarily through what you would call biotechnology," Lyra explained as she helped Marcus plant seeds that glowed with their own soft light. "We grow our art, shape it through selective cultivation, create beauty that lives and changes and evolves." The alien plants were unlike anything in Earth's biosphere. They seemed to respond to emotional states, changing color and pattern based on the moods of those tending them. Some produced music when touched by wind or rain, others generated fragrances that varied with the time of day and season. All of them required care techniques that combined traditional gardening with energy work that stretched Marcus's understanding of what was possible. "These plants are not just decorative," Lyra said as they worked together to create growing conditions that would allow terrestrial and Andorian species to coexist. "They are partners in the creative process. We collaborate with them to produce beauty that neither species could achieve alone." Marcus learned to sense the subtle energies that the alien plants required, developing abilities he hadn't known he possessed. Under Lyra's guidance, he discovered that he could influence plant growth through focused intention, could communicate with growing things in ways that went beyond simple observation of their physical needs. "You have the gift," Lyra said one evening as they watched his latest plantings respond to his attention with visible changes in their bioluminescent patterns. "It is rare, even among my people. The ability to truly partner with growing things, to become part of their life cycle rather than simply manipulating it from outside." "What does that mean for us?" Marcus asked. "It means that our first 2 compatibility dimensions are strongly positive," Lyra said, her tone containing satisfaction and something deeper. "We nourish each other well, and we can create beauty together that neither of us could achieve alone." The third phase, intellectual resonance, proved more challenging. Lyra's knowledge base was vast and, often incomprehensible to Marcus, spanning sciences and philosophies developed across multiple worlds over thousands of years. Her casual references to concepts like temporal mechanics and quantum consciousness made him feel intellectually inadequate in ways that were sometimes overwhelming. "I don't understand half of what you're talking about," Marcus admitted one evening after Lyra had spent an hour explaining Andorian approaches to sustainable planetary management. "How can we be compatible if I can't keep up with your thinking?" Lyra looked at him with surprise that seemed genuine. "Marcus, intellectual resonance is not about matching knowledge bases or processing speed. It is about curiosity, openness to new ideas, and the ability to think creatively about complex problems." "But, you know things I can't even comprehend. And you understand things that are completely outside my experience," Lyra countered. "Your intuitive grasp of how to create emotional comfort through food, your ability to build trust with strangers through simple kindness, your skill at finding practical solutions to everyday problems, these are forms of intelligence that my people value highly but rarely possess." She moved closer to him on the couch, her bioluminescence shifting to warmer tones. "Intelligence is not a single trait, Marcus. It is a constellation of different abilities and approaches. What matters in a partnership is not whether two beings think alike, but whether they can learn from each other and solve problems together more effectively than either could alone." Over the following weeks, Marcus began to understand what Lyra meant. While he couldn't match her theoretical knowledge, he found that his practical problem-solving skills and emotional intelligence complemented her analytical abilities in ways that produced insights neither of them would have reached independently. The fourth phase, emotional resonance, proved to be both easier and more intense than Marcus had expected. Andorian emotional expression was more direct and multidimensional than human communication, involving changes in bioluminescence, harmonic vocalizations, and energy fields that Marcus was gradually learning to perceive. "We do not hide our feelings or pretend to feel what we do not," Lyra explained as she demonstrated how her skin patterns reflected her current emotional state. Deception in emotional matters is considered one of the most serious violations of trust in our culture. Marcus found this level of emotional transparency both exhilarating and terrifying. With Lyra, there was no possibility of misunderstanding or playing games or protecting himself through emotional distance. When she was happy, her entire being radiated joy in ways that were impossible to fake. When she was concerned or frustrated or sad, her distress was equally visible and genuine. "Can you learn to read my emotions the way I'm learning to read yours?" Marcus asked. "I am already learning," Lyra said. "Human emotional expression is more subtle than Andorian, but no less complex. Your eyes change color very slightly when you are content. Your breathing pattern shifts when you are worried about something. The way you move your hands reveals whether you are confident or uncertain about a decision." The realization that Lyra could read his emotional state with such accuracy was initially unsettling, but Marcus gradually came to appreciate the deep intimacy it created between them. With her, he never had to wonder whether his feelings were understood or reciprocated. The honesty was challenging but also liberating. The fifth phase, creative synergy, built on the work they'd already been doing with cooking and gardening, but expanded to include other forms of artistic expression. Lyra introduced Marcus to Andorian music, which involved harmonics that seemed to resonate directly with the listener's nervous system, creating emotional and, sometimes physical responses that went far beyond normal auditory experience. "Music, for my people, is not just entertainment," Lyra explained as she demonstrated techniques that made her voice produce impossible harmonies. "It is communication, healing, celebration, meditation. A truly skilled musician can use sound to create specific emotional states, to promote physical healing, even to facilitate spiritual experiences." Marcus had never considered himself particularly musical, but, under Lyra's guidance, he discovered that he had an intuitive understanding of how sound affected mood and atmosphere. Together, they began creating compositions that combined human musical traditions with Andorian harmonic techniques, producing songs that were unlike anything either culture had developed independently. The sixth phase, spiritual alignment, proved to be the most challenging aspect of their courtship. Andorian spiritual practices involved concepts that stretched the boundaries of Marcus's materialist worldview, including direct communication with what Lyra called the consciousness of growing things and meditation techniques that seemed to involve actual manipulation of energy fields. "I'm not sure I believe in this stuff," Marcus admitted after a particularly intense session that had left him feeling as though he'd touched something vast and alive that existed beyond normal sensory perception.
Belief is not required, Lyra said gently. Only openness to experience.
My people learned long ago that the universe contains forms of consciousness and connection that cannot be measured by instruments or explained by logic alone. Gradually, through practices that combine meditation with gardening and cooking, Marcus began to experience what Lyra described as the interconnected nature of all living systems. It wasn't a belief he adopted intellectually, but rather a direct perception that developed through repeated experience. As they approached the final phase of courtship, temporal synchronization, Marcus realized that their relationship had already transformed both of them in ways that went far beyond simple compatibility assessment. The systematic exploration of their connection had created a bond deeper than anything he'd experienced with another being. But the final phase would bring challenges that tested everything they'd built together, and decisions that would determine not just their personal future but the fate of the growing connection between their two species. The final phase of Andorian courtship, temporal synchronization, was unlike anything Marcus could have imagined. It required the couple to experience shared visions of potential futures, to align their life rhythms with cosmic cycles, and ultimately to make a commitment that was witnessed not just by their communities but by the universe itself. Time, for my people, is not linear, Lyra explained as she prepared for the ritual that would either bind them together permanently or reveal fundamental incompatibilities that would end their relationship. We experience it as a flowing river with many currents and eddies. True partnership requires finding currents that flow together rather than against each other. The ceremony took place in Marcus's rooftop garden on the night of the winter solstice. Lyra had spent days preparing, arranging the alien plants in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythms, creating geometric designs that made the entire space feel like a living mandala. The terrestrial plants had responded to the alien influence by producing blooms and fragrances that were more intense and beautiful than anything Marcus had seen during the growing season.
What exactly is going to happen? Marcus asked as Lyra made final adjustments to the arrangements.
Her bioluminescence was brighter than he'd ever seen it, shifting through patterns that seemed to reflect internal music he couldn't hear. We will drink the ceremonial preparation together, Lyra said, indicating a crystalline vessel that contained liquid that moved like mercury but glowed with soft blue light. This will allow us to perceive time as my people do, to see the potential paths our lives might take both together and apart. If we are truly compatible, we will find ourselves naturally choosing the same paths, drawn to the same possibilities.
And if we're not compatible?
Then, we will see different futures calling to us, and we will have the wisdom to part while our love is still pure and untainted by resentment or disappointment. Marcus looked at the alien substance that would reveal their fate, feeling a mixture of anticipation and terror. 6 months of courtship had convinced him that he wanted to build a life with Lyra, but the systematic exploration of their compatibility had also shown him how many layers existed to a truly successful partnership. There were still aspects of Andorian culture that he didn't understand, still elements of his own humanity that might prove incompatible with her otherworldly nature. "I'm scared," he admitted. Lyra moved to stand beside him, taking his hands in hers. Her touch carried that familiar warmth and energy that made him feel grounded and alive. "Fear is appropriate," she said gently. "We are about to make the most important decision of our lives. But, Marcus, whatever we see tonight, whatever paths the future reveals, I want you to know that these months with you have been the most meaningful of my existence." They drank the ceremonial preparation together as midnight approached, sharing the glowing liquid that tasted like starlight and possibility. Almost immediately, Marcus felt his perception of reality begin to shift. The garden around them seemed to expand and contract simultaneously, and he could see layers of time stacked like transparent sheets, showing the same space across different seasons, years, decades. The visions began gradually, like dreams that slowly gained clarity and substance. Marcus saw himself and Lyra working together in an expanded version of his garden, tending plants from dozens of worlds under a sky that held 2 moons. He saw them cooking together in a kitchen equipped with technology that seemed to blend Andorian science with human craftsmanship, preparing meals for gatherings that included beings from multiple species. But the visions went deeper than simple domestic scenes. Marcus saw himself traveling to other worlds, learning about alien ecosystems and farming techniques that could revolutionize agriculture on Earth. He saw Lyra working with human scientists, sharing knowledge that could solve problems of hunger and environmental destruction that had plagued humanity for generations.
Most powerfully, he saw children.
Not human or Andorian, but something new, beings who carried the best traits of both species, who could communicate with plants as naturally as breathing, who understood both the practical kindness of human nature and the cosmic perspective of Andorian civilization.
The visions showed challenges too.
Marcus saw himself struggling to adapt to technologies and social customs that stretched his understanding, saw Lyra fighting to maintain her connection to her people while building a new life on Earth. He saw them facing opposition from both humans and Andorians who disapproved of their mixed union, saw them working to bridge the gap between species that had evolved on different worlds with different values and priorities. But, in every vision, in every potential future, Marcus saw one constant: the deep love and mutual respect that had grown between them. Even in the most difficult scenarios, they faced challenges together, supported each other's growth, found joy in creating something beautiful from their differences. As the ceremonial substance reached its peak effect, Marcus experienced something that Lyra had tried to describe but that he hadn't understood until now: direct perception of the cosmic forces that shaped all life. He felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual existence, touching something vast and ancient and alive that connected all growing things across the galaxy. In that moment of expanded awareness, Marcus understood why the Andorians considered compatibility across multiple dimensions so important. A partnership wasn't just about two individuals choosing to share their lives, it was about two patterns of consciousness learning to harmonize with each other and with the larger symphony of existence. When the visions finally began to fade and normal perception gradually returned, Marcus found himself lying on the rooftop beside Lyra, both of them gazing up at stars that seemed impossibly bright and close. He could feel that something fundamental had shifted between them, a connection that went deeper than emotion or compatibility or shared interests.
"Did you see what I saw?" he asked quietly.
"I saw us choosing each other," Lyra said, her voice carrying harmonics of joy and wonder. "In every timeline, every possibility, every potential future, we chose each other. Even when the paths were difficult, even when we faced opposition or hardship or uncertainty, we chose to build something together rather than apart." Marcus turned to look at her, seeing in her bioluminescent patterns the reflection of what he was feeling.
"So we passed the final test?" "We revealed perfect temporal synchronization," Lyra said, sitting up with fluid grace.
"But, Marcus, this is not the end of the courtship process.
This is the beginning of something else entirely."
Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Lyra stood and moved to a section of the garden where she'd planted a single alien flower that had been dormant since she'd placed it in the soil weeks earlier. As he watched, she began to sing in harmonies that made the air shimmer, and the flower responded by unfurling petals that glowed with their own light. From within the bloom, Lyra withdrew something that took Marcus's breath away. It was a ring, but unlike any piece of jewelry he'd ever seen. The band seemed to be made of crystallized starlight, and it held a stone that contained what looked like a miniature galaxy, complete with swirling stars and nebulae that moved with their own internal rhythm. "Marcus Chen," Lyra said, turning to face him with the ring held between them, "by the customs of my people and the witness of the growing things that surround us, I offer you partnership bond that will connect us across space and time and whatever challenges the future may bring." Marcus stared at the impossible ring, understanding that this was not just a proposal but a commitment that carried implications far beyond a simple human marriage.
"What exactly are you asking me?"
"I am asking you to become my life partner according to Andorian law and custom," Lyra said. "This bond, once accepted, creates a connection between us that transcends physical distance and even death. We would share not just our lives but our essential energies, becoming two parts of a single whole."
"And what about Earth customs? What about human law?"
Lyra's expression grew thoughtful. "The bond one offer encompasses but transcends human marriage. If you accept, we would be married by any definition your species recognizes, but we would also be connected in ways that human culture has no words to describe." Marcus looked at the ring that seemed to contain an entire universe, considering the magnitude of what was being offered. This wasn't just about love or compatibility or shared dreams, this was about choosing to link his fate permanently with that of a being from another world, about becoming part of something larger than either of their individual species. "If I say yes," he said carefully, "what happens next?" "Next, we begin the process of building the bridge between our peoples," Lyra said. my evaluation of humanity was positive, and the Collective Council has already approved limited contact protocols based on my recommendations. Our partnership would serve as the foundation for formal diplomatic relations between Earth and the Andorian system. Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders.
So our marriage would be more than personal, it would be political?
It would be transformational, Lyra corrected. For both of our species. The children we might have together would be living proof that biological and cultural differences can be transcended through love and understanding. Our partnership would demonstrate that humans and Andorians can not only coexist but create something beautiful together. Marcus thought about the visions he'd seen during the temporal synchronization ceremony, the glimpses of a future where Earth and dozens of other worlds shared knowledge and resources and perspectives. He thought about the problems that could be solved, the possibilities that could be explored, the expansion of human understanding that could result from connection with an advanced galactic civilization. But, most of all, he thought about Lyra herself, this extraordinary being who had chosen him, who had seen in his simple acts of kindness something worth abandoning her previous life for, who had spent months patiently guiding him through a courtship process designed to reveal the deepest truths about their compatibility.
I have one question, Marcus said finally.
Yes?
Will you still appreciate my cooking after we're bonded?
Because I have to warn you, I'm planning to spend the rest of our lives trying to surprise you with new flavors.
Lyra's laugh was like music, bright and joyful and full of promise.
Marcus Chen, she said, moving closer to him, that is exactly what I am hoping for. He reached out to take the ring from her hands, feeling the warm pulse of energy that seemed to resonate with his own heartbeat. The band adjusted itself automatically to fit his finger perfectly, and, the moment it settled into place, Marcus felt a connection open between them that was deeper than thought or emotion. Through that connection, he could sense Lyra's joy and love and hope for their future. But, more than that, he could feel her connection to the growing things around them, her awareness of the cosmic forces that shaped life across the galaxy, her deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all existence.
Yes, he said simply. To all of it.
To the bond, to the responsibility, to building bridges between worlds.
Yes, to whatever comes next.
The moment the word left his lips, the alien plants in the garden began to glow more brightly, and Marcus could swear he heard music coming from the earth itself, a song of celebration that seemed to acknowledge the significance of what had just occurred. As they stood together in the garden surrounded by impossible beauty, Marcus realized that his quiet life of cooking and growing vegetables had somehow led him to become part of the most important moment in human history. He was no longer just Marcus Chen, freelance web developer, he was Marcus Chen, first human to be bonded to an Andorian, bridge between worlds, proof that love could transcend any boundary. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and wonders and possibilities that neither species could have imagined alone. But, as Lyra took his hand and they stood together under stars that no longer seemed distant and cold but welcoming and full of potential, Marcus knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And, somewhere in the depths of space, the Collective Council was already preparing for first contact with a species that